Welcome to American Ambition, a history podcast about plans, hopes, and visions for the future of the United States. This is episode 3, Texas and Mexico, the 4th episode in a series tracking the 19th century political crisis that led to the American Civil War in 1861. You may remember last episode, we got ourselves up to speed with the abolitionists, discussing how they transitioned from advocating gradual to immediate abolition, and the different responses these provoked from slaveholders. We also discussed the success they had in growing their movement during the 1830s, as well as the violence they faced as they did so. In this episode, our primary topic of discussion is the Mexican-American War, specifically what led up to it and the fallout that resulted from it. We'll be talking about independent Texas, a much-slandered amendment known as the Wilmot Proviso, as well as the Compromise of 1850, a sort of attempt to close the Pandora's box that the war with Mexico had opened. These are our 3 main points for this episode, but I'm going to start back in 1837, at the end of Andrew Jackson's second term, to explain how we got into this whole Texas question in the first place. Now, following Jackson's second term in office, the Democratic mantle passed to Martin Van Buren, a New York politico who, along with Jackson, had been instrumental in founding the Democratic Party. Van Buren is little remembered now, but in many ways he was responsible for the modern American political party. He did much of the behind-the-scenes work to rally urban workers and Southern enslavers into an electoral bloc that could win Jackson the presidency. In doing so, he spearheaded a major change that I referenced last time, a change in political culture, from one in which openly affiliating with a formal party was seen as a sign that one prized their faction over the good of the country, to one in which party loyalty was a virtue and a primary qualification for office holding. Like John Quincy Adams, who spent 15 years after his presidency as a prominent anti-slavery congressman, Van Buren is a little-remembered one-term president who was in fact one of the more influential statesmen of their era when they weren't president, that is. Now, part of the reason Van Buren wasn't terribly influential is that he took office at possibly the worst time. Just as he was being inaugurated in March of 1837, the U.S. economy entered a tailspin that we now call the Panic of 1837. This recession continued for basically his entire term in office, and so as you can imagine, getting reelected in 1840 was an uphill battle. His opponents in the Whig Party creatively nicknamed him Martin Van Ruin. Very, very funny. It didn't help that Van Buren could be a bit haughty in person. He had a real taste for the finer things in life. So it was easy to portray him as some sort of wannabe aristocrat, out of touch with the common man, and deaf to the suffering of the average American. And this is a real contrast to how the Whigs portrayed their candidate, William Henry Harrison. You may have noticed the old political trick in which a political candidate who comes from immense wealth and or privilege decides to run for office. And the moment they throw their hat in the ring, suddenly they're no longer a rich investment banker with 3 homes and a father who owned the Los Angeles Lakers or whatever. Now they're a tough working man who likes hunting and football and isn't one of those Washington insiders, you know? But William Harrison was the first guy to really pull off that stunt in a presidential race. William Harrison was born in 1773 into a wealthy slaveholding family in Virginia. And I don't think it would be going too far to say that the Harrisons, who had been in Virginia since 1630, were practically American royalty. Perhaps you've seen John Trumbull's famous painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Well, if you look it up, there's a guy on the far left sitting at a desk, and that's William Harrison's dad, Benjamin Harrison V. So you get the idea. William is from a old and influential family, old money slave owners. But as an adult, he refashioned himself as a plain-spoken Midwesterner. He was the first territorial governor of Indiana, a senator from Ohio, and he enjoyed significant popularity as a military hero after leading Indiana militia to victory over Shawnee Indians at the Battle of Tippecanoe. When the Whigs nominated him for the presidency, they portrayed him not as the scion of old money Virginia, but as a frontier rustic, a man of the people who lived in a common log cabin and was fond of drinking hard cider. This imagery was deliberate and ubiquitous. The log cabin was a common basic shelter used on the western frontier, and hard cider was the alcoholic beverage of choice because it could be home brewed out of otherwise inedible apples. Whigs used the mass mobilization techniques that Van Buren had pioneered and turned them up a notch. They wrote songs and penned catchy slogans. They held public spectacles and passed out toasts of cider in honor of their candidate. All this sort of election spectacle and enthusiasm is kind of par for the course for us, but it was completely new at the time. Now, behind all this hoopla, the Whigs were actually advancing a theory of public policy. They argued that Jackson and Van Buren's hostility to banking and the financial system had created the recession they were all mired in, and that Whig proposals to support industry and build infrastructure would help get them out of it. These sorts of economic issues were at the heart of debates between Whigs and Democrats, whether banks were an essential tool to finance America's future or bastions of privilege that must be destroyed, whether economic prosperity would come from making sure there was enough land for every man to have a farm, or from protecting nascent manufacturing industries and allowing them to expand. The parties were national parties. Van Buren, a Northerner, led a party who counted rich Southern enslavers as one of their primary constituencies. Henry Clay, a Southerner, was the policy architect of a party that counted many Northern merchants and manufacturers as loyal voters. There were manufacturers in Southern cities such as Richmond who saw Whig protectionist trade policies as a boon for them. And there are many poor laborers in northern cities like New York who saw Democratic promises of more land for independent farmers as their ticket to an independent and more prosperous livelihood. Now, the Whigs ultimately claimed victory in the 1840 election, but their joy was short-lived. 3 weeks into his presidency, Harrison caught a chill after getting caught in the rain while taking a walk. He developed pneumonia, something his doctor could not alleviate, despite administering bloodletting, opium, laudanum, wine, and brandy. He died a week later. His running mate, Vice President John Tyler, was less committed to Whig principles than Harrison. He was a Whig primarily because of his personal distaste for Jackson, not because he believed that infrastructure improvements and protective tariffs were the road to American greatness. As a result, Tyler was bound for a turbulent presidency, disliked by just about everybody. The Democrats didn't like him because he was a Whig. The Whigs didn't like him because he wasn't really a Whig, and in fact, he vetoed some of the Whigs' most important legislation. To top it all off, many considered Tyler to be a sort of illegitimate president. You see, no president had ever died in office before. Tyler was the first president to succeed to the office mid-term, and before the 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967, the Constitution was a little unclear on this issue. In 1841, the relevant passage read, quote, "In case of the removal of the president from office, the powers and duties of the president shall devolve to the vice president," unquote. Perhaps you see the problem here. It never says Tyler is the president, only that he has the powers and duties of the president. This may seem like a ridiculous lawyerism, but it led folks who were already disinclined to like Tyler to view him as not a real president, just someone sort of keeping the seat warm, dubbed by his enemies his accidency. Tyler did, however, have one major accomplishment, so to speak, but to explain that, we have to talk about Texas. So, Texas had been a part of the frontier province on the northeastern border of the Spanish colony of New Spain until New Spain didn't want to be New Spain anymore. Following a decade of war and revolution in 1821, Texas became part of the frontier province on the northeastern border of Mexico. Now, the Republic of Mexico faced a variety of challenges in its first years as an independent country, and one of those was on their northern border. Specifically, the problem was that the Comanche Indians lived up there, and they didn't really care about Mexican borders. Since the 1750s, the Comanche had been operating what at least one historian has argued constitutes an empire in what is now West Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and New Mexico. The Comanche had vast herds of horses, which they used both to hunt buffalo and exchange with traders for manufactured goods. They constantly replenished their supply of horses by raiding New Spain and later Mexico. Usually, this meant raiding Texas and New Mexico, but some Comanche bands launched long-distance raiding expeditions deep into the heart of Mexico. Like other empires of the time, the Comanche firmly controlled trade within their territory, which produced a lucrative commodity, in this case horses, that they exchanged with outsiders. Meanwhile, they exploited the peoples on the edge of their empire, in this case Texans, for economic gain. Basically, the Comanche ran the southern Great Plains, and they took what they wanted from the Mexican borderlands because nobody could stop them. One way that the Mexican government had hoped to deal with this was by populating sparsely settled Texas with more people who might make the Comanche think twice before launching a raid, or maybe even fight them off if they did show up. Many people, as you might expect, weren't really up for this, so they turned to the only folks who might be dumb enough to live in an occasional war zone in exchange for free land: Americans. Beginning in 1821, Mexico began offering large land grants to American settlers who would take up residence in Texas, provided they obey Mexican law and eventually convert to Catholicism. Americans from the southern and western United States began to take them up on this offer, although they ignored both of these conditions. Many of these American settlers brought enslaved people with them, while Mexico as a whole was working to gradually end slavery. Within 10 years, the Mexican government realized they had made a mistake. In 1829, they abolished slavery, and when it became clear that the Americans on their northern border had no intention of abiding by this law, they barred further American immigration in 1830. This did little to stem the tide, however, and by the mid-1830s, the now American-dominated slave-owning Texans decided they didn't want anything to do with their rulers in Mexico City and launched a revolt. That revolt lasted about 6 months and ended in mid-1836 when, 7 weeks after the siege of the Alamo, a Texan army defeated a Mexican army led by President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, capturing the president in the process. While Santa Anna agreed to order the Mexican army to retreat in exchange for his own freedom, he did not recognize Texan independence. So, for the next 5 years, while Texas grew as a de facto independent state, and its population of enslaved people grew nearly eightfold to nearly 40,000 people, Texas existed in a sort of legal limbo, technically still part of Mexico, but functionally independent. Its leaders, including President Sam Houston, soon angled to end that independence by being annexed by the United States. President Tyler supported this for a couple of reasons. He was a slave owner and favored the expansion of slavery by adding more slaveholding states. And he also hoped to secure his own popularity in the South and redeem his largely ineffectual administration. But the argument Tyler and his allies made publicly was that Texas annexation was a matter of self-defense. Britain, they warned, having abolished slavery in 1834, now sought to do the same in Texas, and thereby weaken the United States. Britain's plan, this theory ran, was that Britain would offer Texas some favorable commercial deals in exchange for abolition, that Texas would then become a free haven for escaping enslaved people, and which would help ratchet up tensions between free and slave states, leading to internal discord and the eventual destruction of the American Union to the benefit of the British. If this sounds a bit far-fetched, it's worth remembering what we talked about when we discussed the concept of union in our first episode. White Americans understood themselves as engaged in a providential experiment in Republican self-government which would naturally opposed and would be opposed by the monarchs and emperors of the world. It was entirely consistent with this view that Britain would conspire to destroy a Republican potential rival through devious diplomatic trickery. Only the admission of Texas as a slave state, Tyler and his allies argued, could prevent this disastrous outcome. There was, by this time, however, an anti-slavery bloc in Congress, the body who had to approve any potential annexation. And they thought this was all bullshit. In 1843, John Quincy Adams and 9 congressional co-authors issued a pamphlet in which they argued that annexation must be opposed at all costs. With annexation, they argued, the, quote, undue ascendancy of the slave-holding power in this government would be secured and riveted beyond all redemption, unquote. You remember when we talked in our first episode about how Northerners came to see the 3/5 clause as a mistake that granted slaveholders too much power? Well, this is what they mean by the undue ascendancy, that enslavers have a built-in advantage, and they're going to try to keep exploiting it to keep free white men down. Annexation was a nefarious project, Adams and his co-authors warned, and major Whig newspapers like the New York Tribune agreed, denouncing the slaveholders', quote, incessant plotting. This annexation question dominated the 1844 presidential election. The Democratic nominee, James K. Polk, ran as an ardent annexationist, while Henry Clay, the Whigs nominee for a third time, found it impossible to balance the emerging anti-slavery Northern Bible Belt with the pro-slavery Southern wing of his party, and he embarrassed himself by first cautiously rejecting annexation, then endorsing it, then repudiating his endorsement and rejecting it again. Democrats had a field day mocking Clay and won comfortably in the Electoral College. But 1844 also marked a major step forward in national anti-slavery politics. Beginning in 1840, some activists had begun rejecting Garrison's position that the Constitution was inherently pro-slavery, arguing instead that it could be read as an anti-slavery document. This faction concluded that they did not need to reject electoral politics, as Garrison declared, but instead they should run their own candidates and attempt to influence the government. In 1840, this group of abolitionists and anti-slavery politicians made a run at the presidency, nominating reformed slaveholder James Birney as the candidate of the Liberty Party. With little time for preparation and organization, Birney drew only 7,000 votes. In 1844, however, Birney's share of the vote had significantly improved, and he received over 65,000 votes. The Liberty Party had yet to receive an electoral college vote. This only amounted to about 2% of the vote nationally, however, and the Liberty Party had yet to receive a single electoral vote, but this was still a dramatic increase. In part due to fear about losing votes to this new party, Northern Democrats and Whigs united in 1844 to repeal the gag rule that had prevented anti-slavery petitions from being heard in Congress. That same month, now lame duck President Tyler pushed Congress to consider a joint resolution to annex Texas. Congressional debate over the coming months made little progress. One of the few Whigs to support annexation, Tennessean Milton Brown, proposed admitting the vast state of Texas all at once, but giving it the choice to later split into as many as 5 separate states. When this plan didn't get much support, Missouri Democrat Thomas Benton proposed a compromise. East Texas, where the vast majority of Texans and virtually every white American Texan lived, would be admitted as its own state, while the rest of Texas would become a territory to be admitted at some later date, possibly without slavery. President-elect Polk agreed that Benton's plan was acceptable, and an annexation resolution passed by a slim margin. And this is when Tyler pulls one of the greatest double crosses in American history. Before his term expired, he offered Texas annexation, as Congress had approved, but he offered them Brown's all of Texas plan, rather than the Benton East Texas plan that Polk had endorsed and which had convinced Congress to approve annexation. Despite this trickery, Texas accepted, and with that, the Republic of Texas became the 28th state of the Union. So, in short, thanks to a misguided Mexican plan to deal with the Comanche by populating their frontier with Americans, and an American president who no one had really voted for, the U.S. now had a new state. What remained to be seen was how this would go over with Mexico. Now, the U.S. was in a tricky spot with Mexico. They had just announced the annexation of a territory that Mexico had never formally given up in the first place. More than that, Texas and Mexico disagreed about where the southern border of Texas lay, with the Texans claiming the Rio Grande River, while Mexico said that their border lay over 100 miles north at the Nueces River. Clearly hoping to provoke a war, Polk sent U.S. General Zachary Taylor and 3,000 U.S. soldiers down to this disputed strip of desert in 1845. Ignoring requests to remove the troops, Polk had Taylor and his men establish themselves along the Rio Grande, opposite the Mexican city of Matamoros. Eventually, skirmishes broke out between Taylor's men and the Mexican soldiers sent to investigate what they argued was an incursion into their territory. Declaring that blood had been shed on American soil, Polk asked Congress for a declaration of war, and in April of 1846, the war was officially on. Now, this war went quite well for the Americans. General Taylor advanced further south into Mexico and won a significant victory in February 1847 at the Battle of Buena Vista and the mountains of Coahuila. 2 weeks later, and over 500 miles to the south, General Winfield Scott landed with an American army at the port of Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico. Over the course of 6 months, Polk's army marched and fought across the countryside and mountains, eventually capturing Mexico City on September 15th. With 2 successful invasions under their belts and the Mexican capital in hand, the Polk administration felt ready to dictate terms. Now, the goal of Polk and the Democrats in declaring this war was to seize as much of Mexico as they could. Mexico, you may notice from the maps on our website, was a huge country, stretching from what is now the Oregon border all the way down to the Yucatan, from San Francisco Bay to the Sabine River. Democrats like Polk were enamored with the belief that it was the manifest destiny of the United States to claim all of North America as their own, to govern a republic that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. As John O'Sullivan, the Democratic newspaperman who coined the phrase manifest destiny, so memorably wrote, quote, "Yes, more till our national destiny is fulfilled and the whole boundless continent is ours." The only thing Democrats really disagreed about was how much of Mexico to take when they eventually won the war. Some rallied around the cry of all of Mexico, declaring that the whole country should be annexed, while others worried about the potential consequences for their predominantly white, predominantly Protestant republic if they tried to assimilate so many Catholics and people of Indian descent. And these people argued that instead the U.S. should seize only the less populated portion above the Rio Grande River. With the acquisition of so much land below the Missouri Compromise line, they argued, slavery would have room to grow in America for decades to come. This didn't sit well with some Democrats, however. Aggression against Mexico wasn't the only thing Polk had campaigned on. His campaign trail rallying cry had been 54-40 or fight, a reference to the Oregon Territory, which was claimed and disputed by both the United States and Britain. 54-40 was a demand that the boundary of American Oregon be fixed at the 54th parallel, which would have put it roughly on the southern border of modern Alaska. Now, since the U.S. doesn't own Vancouver, this clearly didn't happen. In fact, before declaring war on Mexico, Polk completed negotiations with the British to set the boundary at what is now the northern border of the state of Washington, a significant step back. Some Northern Democrats watched this retreat, in parallel with the rush to war with Mexico, with displeasure. Polk, a Tennessee slaveholder, had compromised on Northerners' claims to additional territory, meekly knuckling under to the haughty Brits, despite his promise to fight. But when it came to Southern claims to new territory, Polk rattled his saber and rallied the whole country to war. And so, a somewhat anonymous Pennsylvania Democrat named David Wilmot attached an amendment to an 1846 bill to provide funds for the Army. It read, quote, "Provided that as an express and fundamental condition of the acquisition of any territory from the Republic of Mexico by the United States, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of the said territory." Wilmot and his Northern Democratic colleagues supported the war, sure, but they weren't going to support a war purely for the benefit of slaveholders. Now, this Wilmot proviso, as it becomes known, never becomes law. It's merely the next salvo in the fight over what to do about slavery in the West that is going to take us basically right up to the Civil War. The Wilmot Proviso is repeatedly introduced in some form and repeatedly argued about between 1846 and 1848, and these arguments are very illuminating. On the anti-slavery side, you have people like David Wilmot who are desperate to distance themselves from abolitionists and prove that anti-slavery and white supremacy are totally compatible. In a speech in late 1847, Wilmot declared, quote, "I make no war upon the South, nor upon slavery in the South. I have no squeamish sensitiveness on the subject of slavery, no morbid sympathy for the slave. I plead the cause of the rights of white freemen. I would preserve for free white labor a fair country, a rich inheritance, where the sons of toil of my own race and color can live without the disgrace which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor. The white labor of the North claims your service. He demands that you stand firm to his interests and his rights, that you preserve the future homes of his children on the distant shores of the Pacific from the degradation and dishonor of Negro servitude." So what is Wilmot saying there? Well, he's trying to distance himself from abolitionists, for one, right? He says he has no sympathy with the enslaved. He's very clear that he sees anti-slavery legislation as a benefit for white people. The word morbid in this context is a synonym for overwrought, emotional. He's trying to say he bears no silly feminine sentimentality for enslaved people the way an abolitionist does. Instead, he's arguing that the future of America should be free white workers and their families, and that the introduction of slavery to a territory degrades, to use his word, the value of white labor. To have a white person doing the same work as a slave, he argues, makes white people lesser. Wilmot is arguing that anti-slavery can be masculine, that it doesn't have to be based in supposedly feminine sympathy, that it can be about protecting the honor and dignity of white men and their dependent families. Wilmot sees slavery as a problem, yes, but the problem is not how enslaved people are treated or the very concept of owning people. His problem is that he thinks if slaveholders are allowed to introduce slavery into the West, then it won't become a land of only white families. Like colonization and Indian removal that we talked about last time, anti-slavery for men like Wilmot is about creating a white future for America, and he isn't afraid to tell you that is exactly what he thinks. James Seddon, congressman from Virginia, offered a characteristic response. Quote, "Should the offensive bill of the gentleman from New York pass, the combined action of all the departments of this government, with all its moral and political influence, will have been enlisted in the direct attempt to subvert the fundamental equality of the Constitution, in an insidious design to undermine the institutions of one half of the states, and to stigmatize and depreciate their property and their labor. The palpable exclusion of slaveholders with their property from the joint acquisitions of common treasure and blood would alone have sufficed, but the legislation of the Republic, arrayed against our property and our peace, immeasurably exceeds even that direct wrong. The people of the South could never and would never endure it." Seddon, as we can see, portrays this as an issue of both fairness and safety. He talked about the Mexican territory the U.S. would seize as something shared, something the U.S. had acquired through their, quote, common treasure and blood. He argued that this threatened Southerners' equality within the Union, that to ban slavery would stigmatize Southern enslavers. He argues that slaveholders would be unable to safely continue enslaving people if any conquered Mexican territory were to remain free. This would undermine slavery, he declares. It would threaten slaveholders' quote, property and our peace. Seddon was arguing that it would be unfair for the Mexican territory to be implicitly set aside for the people of only one half of the country, that is, the free states, and that by using the federal government to do this, it implies that there's something wrong with slavery, that the government is being used against them. Seddon also argues that they cannot keep on enslaving people with free territory so close. It would be too easy for enslaved people to escape, And if enslaved people could escape too easily, enslavers won't be able to reliably and prosperously operate in western states like Missouri and Louisiana. Seddon sees this as both a slap in the face and a threat to the enslaver's way of life. What we're seeing here is the formation of an ideological divide. Both Seddon and Wilmot are Democrats. But while Wilmot is articulating an ideology of free labor, Seddon believes in slavery. And you'll notice that implicit in both their arguments is the belief that the socioeconomic system they believe in must expand to survive. This is critical to explaining how the possible expansion of slavery, rather than just the existence of slavery in some states, led to the Civil War. These were Americans who believed in the promise of the Union that we talked about on that first day, the notion that the U.S. was an almost divinely ordained free republic, destined to span the continent and become an example of liberty to all the world. And when people like Wilmot imagined slaveholders setting up shop in California, and men like Seddon faced down the prospect of slavery being almost entirely banned west of the Mississippi, they saw themselves being written out of the future of America. This is the feeling of hope and promise being replaced with frustration and shame. And these feelings are what help propel so many Americans to become concerned over whether slavery or freedom would be the law of the land in the West. So, in summary, while the Mexican-American War was hard fought, the Americans had the upper hand for much of it and captured Mexico City after about 18 months. Stateside, however, Wilmot's controversial amendment, which would have banned slavery in any conquered territory if it had ever been formally adopted, this provided an opportunity for mainstream politicians to debate what they hoped and feared for the future of the United States in the West. Now, Americans were more concerned about their national destiny and their place in the world because of recent international events. As I've mentioned a couple times, Americans had always imagined their union as a sort of lonely Republican outpost, but they kept a hopeful eye out for evidence that the rest of the world might embrace freedom as they had. Haiti, of course, was one such example, but no republic of freed slaves was going to get popular support throughout the United States when there were so many actual enslavers. The wars of independence in South America that began in 1808 and lasted into the 1830s had certainly sparked some hopes that the former Spanish colonies would join the U.S. as model republics. 19th century Americans were fascinated with the General Simón Bolívar, which is attested to by towns like Bolivar, Missouri, Bolivar, Ohio, Bolivar, Tennessee, and Bolivar, New York. But as Bolivar's dream of a massive Grand Columbia dissolved into a series of wars and regional rivalries, many white Americans concluded that really Indians and Catholics were unsuited for the demands of liberty. Instead, for many white Americans, Latin America came to symbolize the difficulty of keeping the Republican ship of state afloat without dissolving into faction and civil war. In 1848, however, Americans' hopes were raised again. Revolts in Sicily and Paris seemed to spread like wildfire across Europe. From Frankfurt to Buda, from Milan to Berlin, protests and uprisings spread as Europeans demand constitutions, guaranteed rights, and liberal and democratic reform. Americans hoped that Europeans might finally be coming to their senses, confining absolutist monarchy to the dustbin of history and securing modern civil and political rights for themselves. But they were disappointed. By early 1849, the kings of Europe had regained control of their countries and rolled back many of the promised reforms. In Hungary, Russian Tsar Nicholas himself led a massive Russian invasion to put down the revolutionaries and restore the authority of the Habsburg dynasty. The American Union would remain, at least in the minds of many Americans, a lonely bearer of the torch of Republican liberty. We've strayed a little far afield, however. The U.S. was currently beating Mexico with its liberty torch until Mexico gave them what they wanted. The result of this was the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, by which the U.S. acquired much of northern Mexico, from the Oregon border to the mouth of the Rio Grande. This was by far the largest acquisition of territory since the Louisiana Purchase nearly 50 years earlier. The United States now truly spanned the entire North American continent. But there remained several issues to be resolved regarding this territory. For one thing, the borders of Texas were still disputed, as Texas claimed chunks of what are now the states of New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Colorado. For another, though the Wilmot Proviso had never been made a law, it was still unclear if slavery would be protected in the new territories, which had been nominally free territory under Mexican law. An additional wrinkle was this little thing you might have heard of called the California Gold Rush. While gold had been discovered near Sacramento in early 1848, it wasn't until President Polk confirmed the discovery in his presidential message that December that people realized the rumors of gold were, for real, and began to swarm to the Pacific coast. There would be much for Polk's successor and Congress to determine about the fate of Western North America. Polk's successor would be determined by the presidential election of 1848. The Whigs, who had opposed Polk's aggression in Mexico, decided there's nothing wrong with jumping on the wartime bandwagon and nominated slaveholding General Zachary Taylor. Taylor was a man who, I will note, the 2016 Washington Post column described as looking as if he had glued straw to his head and then spent 20 years drinking grain alcohol in the blistering sunlight. In front of Northern audiences, Whigs promised that Taylor would not veto any legislation regarding slavery in the territories. Basically, they were saying, yeah, he's a slaveholder, but he's not so committed to slavery that he'll stifle the will of the people over it. In front of Southern audiences, they trumpeted Taylor's status as a Louisiana planter, surely someone who could be trusted to defend the interests of his fellow enslavers. Like with old Harrison, the Whigs had chosen a military hero whose primary qualifications were pre-existing popularity and few on-the-record statements about political issues. The Democrats were also in the game of telling different stories to different audiences. Their nominee was Lewis Cass, chief proponent of a solution to the whole slavery in the territories question that he had dubbed popular sovereignty. The appeal of the popular sovereignty solution was simple. It proposed allowing the residents of individual territories to choose the status of slavery or freedom for themselves. The devil, of course, was in the details. Before Northern audiences, Cass boosters declared that this solution offered an easy chance to prevent the extension of slavery. If settlers of a territory simply passed an ordinance in their territorial government, then no slavery for them. Before Southern audiences, however, Democrats said such an ordinance should only be voted on once a territory had reached 60,000 residents, the minimum threshold for consideration as a state. That would mean that there was plenty of time when slavery was effectively legalized when enslavers could establish a presence in the territory, whatever that may be. Now, some Northern Democrats and Whigs, rallied by the debates of the Wilmot Proviso and opposed to the expansion of slavery, defected and ran a third-party candidate. They teamed up with the Liberty Party, who had been putting up redeemed slaveholder James Birney for president, and together they formed the Free Soil Party, a single-issue party devoted to making the territory acquired from Mexico so-called free soil. That is, territory where slavery was banned. These guys nominated old Martin Van Buren, who now rejected the pro-slavery Democrats and embraced the anti-slavery extension platform of Wilmot's allies. At this point, Free Soilers were not much trying to win outright. They knew they didn't have the numbers to secure the presidency or a congressional majority, but they hoped to secure a crucial wedge of congressmen and electoral votes, allowing them to play kingmaker in exchange for anti-slavery expansion concessions. Well, Van Buren ended up winning about 10% of the popular vote, almost 5 times what Birney had won 4 years earlier. He still did not receive any electoral votes. The Free Soilers did, however, secure about a dozen congressional seats, which will be important later. With 47% of the vote and a healthy majority of the electoral votes, Zachary Taylor provided the Whigs with their second presidential victory of the decade and sat poised to oversee the organization of the territory he had helped conquer. Before we get to our big political showdown to end this week's episode, however, I should mention one other revolutionary movement that was taking off in 1848. That summer, a convention of women's rights activists gathered in the town of Seneca Falls in upstate New York to debate and discuss the plight of women in the United States, and the world more broadly. The organizers, women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, were, for the most part, veteran anti-slavery activists who sought to apply some of their organizational skills to their own oppression. The anti-slavery movement was in many ways the direct trigger for the Seneca Falls meeting. At the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, Stanton and Mott were not admitted as delegates and were instead relegated to the gallery, hidden behind a curtain. Outraged, the two pledged to hold a meeting of their own, which, nearly a decade later, became Seneca Falls. Stanton and her husband Henry were associated with both the Liberty and then Free Soil parties. Stanton, as part of the politically active wing of the anti-slavery movement, believed the vote to be an essential tool to reform society. The manifesto that the Seneca Falls Convention produced reflected this. The Declaration of Sentiments demanded property rights and increased economic and educational opportunity for women, but the most radical demand was that women be allowed to vote. To appreciate how radical this was, we need to keep in mind some of the other women-led political activism we've discussed. The abolitionist petition campaign, which did so much to both involve Northern women in political activism and offend Southern sensibilities, well, this carried a very different tone. Petitions are requests. They were understood as inherently subservient, something addressed from an inferior to a superior. You may recall that this was part of the appeal of the petition campaign for women who were just getting into politics. Petitioning was a form of activism that was seen, in parts of the North at least, as compatible with traditional female social roles. A petition on behalf of the enslaved could be delivered by a dutiful paragon of Republican motherhood who was only doing her duty as a guardian of national morality by informing her congressman of an evil in need of a remedy. To demand the vote, by contrast, was to assert that women deserve power independent of men, the power to recall their representatives if their entreaties went unheard. The anti-slavery work of these women and their male compatriots had grown real fruit in the decades since the wave of anti-abolitionist violence had largely abated. You may have noticed there are fully anti-slavery political parties now. There were anti-slavery wings of both the Whigs and the Democrats. The anti-slavery Whigs tended to think slavery an inefficient labor system that was blunting American progress, while the anti-slavery Democrats tended to think that large slave owners were an American aristocracy that, if left unchecked, would grow too powerful and threaten the prosperity of the common white man. But the point is, they could agree, even if they weren't ready to jump ship and join the Free Soil Party, they could agree that they didn't much like slavery and they didn't approve of its expansion. And as a result, the idea of banning slavery or the slave trade in Washington, D.C., one of the original requests those anti-slavery petitioners had made almost 2 decades ago, well, these requests were getting a bit more traction. And this did not go unnoticed by John Calhoun, the senator and former vice president who has been skulking around the background of this story, muttering about the injustices done to enslavers. Calhoun and his friends among the Democrats did not trust this new Whig president, Taylor, and feared he would assent to this harebrained scheme to abolish slavery in the Capitol. Before Taylor took office, a convention of Southern congressmen gathered to denounce any plans to end slavery or slave trading in Washington. This was the occasion of Calhoun's infamous Southern Address, when the marks of the master class, as one historian named him, laid out all his accumulated grievances with his Northern countrymen. Presented as a resolution for their fellow congressmen, Calhoun labeled these grievances, quote, "the most important subject ever presented for your consideration," unquote. Calhoun called on the federal government to forcibly return escaped enslaved people, what he called a, quote, "solemn injunction of the supreme law." Calhoun lamented that, quote, "the great body of the North is united against our peculiar institution," a euphemism for slavery, and he predicted that any attempt to emancipate the enslaved would lead to the, quote, "prostration of the white race." If the abolitionists and anti-slavery congressmen got their way, Calhoun predicted, soon white Americans would be subordinated to their former slaves, and the American South would forever become the, quote, "the permanent abode of disorder, anarchy, poverty, misery, and wretchedness." Calhoun's speech was extreme, even for pro-slavery Southerners. Fewer than half of the Southerners in Congress agreed to sign on to the resolution. But those who did would quickly become the revolutionary vanguard of secession. Calhoun would soon be dead, but his Democratic colleagues would carry on his arguments, who would argue that Southern secession was the only honorable response to repeated insult and aggression from the North. They had already formed a revolutionary clique. Known as the Fire Eaters, these most radical of the pro-slavery politicians would spend the next decade riling up Southerners whenever they could and normalizing the idea of secession. Now, Taylor did have a plan for what to do as soon as he got into office, but it was not exactly what Calhoun and his allies feared. Taylor wanted to quickly organize the territory seized from Mexico. There were two practical reasons for this. First, to prevent Congress from getting bogged down in debating the Wilmot Proviso again, and second, California, one of those territories, was currently overrun by ne'er-do-wells looking to make it rich and could really use some law and order. Taylor was an old Army guy, and this sort of disorder didn't sit well with him. So Taylor attempted to admit both California and New Mexico as states before Congress came back to session in late 1849. California would be a free state, as the relatively few slave owners there were dwarfed by the recently arrived make-it-rich population. Taylor said he would take New Mexico however it came, free or slave, and he also gave it some of the territory of Texas. To be blunt, nobody liked this. Or at least there was enough in it that enough people didn't like that the proposal was dead on arrival in Washington. Free Soilers and Free Soil sympathizers weren't happy that Taylor had effectively conceded New Mexico to Cass's popular sovereignty idea. The pro-slavery folks weren't happy that Taylor was ready to just hand California to the North as a free state. There were folks, mostly Northern Whigs, for example, who were on board with this, but that was about it. And these Northern Whigs were unlikely to get much of a say because the Democrats held a slight plurality in the House of Representatives, meaning that they, in theory, would be able to have their own candidate elected speaker, and thereby choose what legislation was voted up or down. I say in theory because the Free Soilers, holding 13 of the 230 seats, had just enough votes to play spoiler, and so the Democrats' candidate for speaker, George enslaver Howell Cobb, could not be elected. Why, you might wonder, am I taking such a digression into these parliamentary details? Because the debate for the speaker position in early 1849 was the site of some of the most acrimonious threats of treason yet made in the U.S. Congress. William Dewar, one of those Northern Whigs from New York, denounced Virginia's Richard Meade as a disunionist. Rather than deny the accusation, Robert Toombs of Georgia declared that if Dewar and his ilk sought to, quote, drive us from the territories of California and New Mexico and, quote, fix a national degradation upon the South, then, in his words, quote, I am for disunion. This spectacle by extremist Southern Democrats made Cobb seem moderate by comparison, allowing him to secure a couple of cross-the-aisle votes he needed to win the speakership. For those Northerners who already believed Southern slaveholders held too much power in the government, it looked like another coup for this outnumbered American oligarchy. Anti-slavery Senator Salmon Chase wrote to an ally that he found the slaveholders' tactics transparent and obvious. They, quote, resort freely to menaces of disunion, he complained, because, quote, they are determined to have everything their way. The most recent political flashpoint highlighted what made lawmakers uncomfortable with Taylor's proposal in the first place. It did little to ameliorate the slavery-related issues that were rapidly radicalizing the different regions of the country. Would the rest of the Mexican cession of territory be slave or free? What would be the fate of slavery in the capital? Would the slaveholders get a new law that would enforce the fugitive slave provision of the Constitution as Calhoun wanted? Unless these issues were addressed, they were really just kicking the can down the road. Into the breach stepped Henry Clay for the last time. Already famous as the great compromiser for his work on the Missouri Compromise and the compromise tariff that had diffused the nullification crisis, Clay proposed a series of paired measures that he hoped would end the arguing. California, Clay proposed, would be admitted as a free state, but the Utah and New Mexico territories would develop under popular sovereignty. Texas would give up its extensive territory it claimed in New Mexico, But also, the federal government would assume Texas's debt that it accrued during its time as an independent state. Slave sales would be banned in the District of Columbia, but the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793 would be strengthened. Clay hoped to balance the two emerging factions, but of course a good compromise doesn't make anybody happy. As soon as he announced his proposal, Southern politicians denounced it as an attack. Representative James Mason delivered an address on behalf of a terminally ill Calhoun, denouncing the Northerners as ceaseless aggressors of American history and doubting whether the South could ever survive in a union that included a free California. New York Senator Henry Seward, on the other hand, denounced Calhoun's interpretation of U.S. history, presenting an anti-slavery interpretation of the founding, arguing that there was a, quote, higher law than the Constitution and that slavery was doomed. Perhaps most importantly, President Taylor, who, of course, preferred his own proposal, refused to support Clay's plan. But Clay's plan did ultimately pass, because two important things happened. First, President Taylor died. The president developed indigestion and food poisoning at a 4th of July picnic and perished within the week. Millard Fillmore, his vice president and successor, was not committed to Taylor's plan, and he was willing to sign on to an alternative. Second, a young Illinois senator, still in his 30s, named Stephen Douglas, took over the management of Clay's compromise bill and adopted a new legislative strategy. Rather than pass the whole thing all at once and have everyone vote up or vote down, yay or nay, Douglas decided to split the bill into its component parts and pass each proposal individually. President Fillmore endorsed this approach, and the strategy was ultimately successful. But ominously, there were few crossover votes between the sections. Every pro-Northern proposal passed with mostly Northern votes, and a couple of pro-compromise Southerners from the Upper South. Every pro-Southern proposal passed with mostly Southern votes, with a couple pro-compromise Northerners from the Lower North. Besides a handful of Kentucky Whigs and Ohio Democrats, there weren't many congressmen who felt much like compromise. Most voted for what they liked, voted against what they didn't, and in retrospect, we call it a compromise. American Ambition is written and performed by me, Stefan Lund, and edited and produced by Luke Vancleave. Our theme music is also by Luke. Thanks for listening, and join us next episode as we discuss the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the boringly named law that, I would argue, did more than just about any other single thing to put the United States on the road towards civil war.